Hello, this is episode 73 of Burnout Solutions. Welcome to Burnout Solutions. My name is Mona Tippett. I am a registered nurse, a life coach, an emotional resiliency expert, and a mom. I love to help healthcare workers and caretakers and just busy, capable people understand their brain and nervous system so stress, overwhelm, and frustration do not run their life. Here on this podcast, we break down burnout, emotional overload, and survival patterns in simple human language. I love to give you practical ways to feel safer, calmer, and more present in your everyday life. You do not need fixing. What you need is support and a nervous system that knows that it's safe. Thanks for being here. Hey there, welcome back to Burnout Solutions. Today, we are actually talking about grief, and I have thought a lot about grief over the last several months, and I'm going to give some examples of why it's crossed my thought loops. Throughout the podcast, I'm going to try really hard to not make this podcast depressing and sad, but I have thought about it, and I've been working with several clients that are going through several different scenarios that I think grief is a good emotion to sum it all up. And we're going to talk about how grief can show up in ways that you may not have labeled it as grief, but you may have experienced similar situations in your own life. One reason that grief has been on my mind most recently is from a news headline of a story that happened pretty close to home at the beginning of August. And I actually heard about this while I was on vacation, and this happened in my home state of Idaho. And because I was on vacation, I didn't have Wi-Fi, I wasn't using my phone, I wasn't watching the news, and so I was not aware. And we sat next to a man, and he said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, we're from Idaho." And he said, "Oh, did you hear what happened in Twin Falls the other day?" And I hadn't. And he told me that there was a shooting at an In and Out restaurant in Twin Falls, which is about 2 hours from where I live, and 3 people were killed and 7 were injured. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I came home from vacation and I read about it, and I just felt pretty sad and had a heavy heart for about 3 days. And I just thought about how we live in a really crazy world and why would this happen? And I thought about these innocent families and just these people that had been affected because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was super interesting to just watch myself feel this grief. And I think this is a very natural, normal human thing to do, that we can grieve with other people. We can grieve other people's circumstances. I have even felt myself grieve after watching a movie that I've gotten sucked into, or a book. It just can hijack you and actually create that emotion in your own body. And I have thought a lot about how grief affects us all in different ways. And that's what I want to talk about today. So today, while you're listening, I encourage you to have an open mind about grief and how you feel it, how others feel it or not, because there are those out there who seem to never be bothered by disappointment, grief, death, or tragedy or loss. And if they are, they process it extremely differently than you do. And maybe they seem very stoic, or they're, you've never seen them cry, or you don't understand how they feel so differently than you do. And I want you to think about where even grief might be coming into your life where you don't expect it. I also want you to think if there's areas in your life where you are still grieving over something that might be holding you back. And I specifically am going to talk about grief when it comes to death, and grief when it has nothing to do with death, but more of an ending of something. But let's just start with talking about death grief for a minute, because I think it's the most common way a lot of us associate grief is with death. Now, death is inescapable. We all know that we are going to die. There's no way around it. And I think just that knowledge can create a lot of anxiety and fear for some people. Even though we all know it's coming for us, I think it's because it's so unknown. We have no idea what it's going to feel like. And a lot of us don't know what's going to happen after. We have our own beliefs. I have my own, and my belief of what happens after death is actually very reassuring and very positive and very hopeful for me. Sometimes I think that death can actually bring a sense of relief, especially if you are watching somebody suffer for a long time with an illness, with a diagnosis, with being in pain. And sometimes even feeling that relief can bring its own layer of guilt. And that it makes it harder for you to grieve or not to grieve because you're judging yourself for going either way. Sometimes death is a shock, like in this situation in Twin Falls in this headline. And I think of those families and feeling that their loved ones were snatched from their life out of order. It was unfair. It was too soon. And shock grief and anticipated grief can bring their own level of complications. And I've had the conversation with lots of people. If it would be easier to watch somebody you love die so that you could say goodbye, so that you could focus on the time that you had versus just having them die unexpectedly. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong or a best or a worst. I do think about how in my culture, I think about how our expectations of death have changed a lot. And I think of how it has shifted enormously in just a few generations. And I don't know if we take that into account in how we grieve today. And if we think about the turn of the century, I had to look this up. The mortality rate of babies, 1 in 6 babies didn't survive their first year of life. And even higher was the mortality rate under 5 years. So death wasn't something that was encountered occasionally by families. It was something that nearly every single family walked through more than once, often in their own homes. And what that meant is that death used to be woven into daily life. I mean, they were faced with it often. I read stories of my ancestors and them burying their children. And they had lots of children and lots of them died. And families sat with dying children and children saw death up close. And there wasn't that same expectation that medicine could or should fix everything. And when you compare that to today, where we have machines and specialists and interventions and medications, and the technology is just rapidly improving, and which I think is amazing. But sometimes I think, especially in healthcare, we feel, or there's an idea that there's a failure of the system if somebody passes away. I was talking to somebody in healthcare, at the beginning of this year, and they were talking about how one of their patients had passed away. And a lot of times in healthcare, we have a debriefing meeting and we talk about that. And they discuss what went wrong and how it could be prevented, and also help people process that emotion. And a lot of times hospitals are docked, or it's marked how many patients die at the hospital as if it were a failure. And I believe that helps create a unhealthy attitude when it comes to death. And it can shift in how we grieve. We're grieving differently than we did 150 years ago. And I personally believe that it's not as healthy, but you can think of however you want. I also know that other cultures hold death differently, and it helps me to zoom out and see how other cultures approach death, because it reminds me that there isn't one correct way to grieve. We were watching the movie Coco the other day, where it talks about the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And there they celebrate death, and they treat death as a continuation of a relationship, not as an ending. Families build their altars of their loved ones, and they share their favorite foods, and they tell stories, and they're dancing, and they're loud, and there's music and all this stuff. And the dead are not somebody that you stop talking about. They're someone that you keep including and you welcome back. at this time of the year, this big celebration, a woman in my congregation at church who passed away after a long battle of cancer, and she did not want a funeral. And in my culture, a funeral is very traditional, and her family had a week where they invited friends and neighbors to come in and share their best memories and just be with the family over the entire week. And I love that. And I know some cultures do that. So what I'm saying is there isn't a universal right way to do this, and there's not a universal wrong way. If your grief looks differently than your neighbors or what you see other people do, that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It just means that you are a human processing grief inside your own body, in your own family, in your own culture, how you know it and maybe feel most comfortable doing it. I have loved expanding my view of death, and I feel like it has helped me handle grief better. When I was a pretty new nurse in labor and delivery, I did experience grief. And the thing about labor and delivery is I love it. It's so happy most of the time. But when it's sad, it seems to be really sad. And there was one day that I was orienting with another nurse, and we had a fetal demise, and it was hard. It was difficult. They had a baby shower. They had celebrated. They had their nursery set up. They had so many things ready to welcome this little baby into their lives. And that was taken from them. And the mother still had to go through labor to deliver this baby. And there's a lot of paperwork and calls that as a nurse we were in charge of, as well as helping the family with their emotions. And anyway, it's just a lot. And I just remember myself and this other nurse walking to the locker room, crying, and we walked out to our car with our arms around each other, just crying. And I had a really good cry that night. And what that taught me, and something that I still believe, is it is okay to mourn with those who are mourning, and feeling that grief in the moment isn't dangerous. It's actually part of what makes us good at our job, what keeps us human, what keeps us connecting to other people in their hardest moments. And that capacity to feel that with somebody is a gift. But I've also learned that, especially in healthcare, we want to protect ourselves from that feeling, and we put up walls. And we feel like if we let ourselves care, it will eventually crush us. This is a big part of the forward-facing program that I got certified in. A lot of it is about relinquishing outcomes. And a lot of it is about you showing up the best you can and controlling what you can, and then letting go at what the outcome is. You do how you were trained, doing your best, and then and just know that still people will die, and you cannot prevent everything. And I believe that is supposed to happen. But sometimes, especially in healthcare, we are left second guessing ourselves. So we can blame ourselves. We become hypervigilant so we don't miss something again. We use that death as a measuring stick against our knowledge and our expertise and our skills. And I don't think that is healthy. I just did a little podcast about carrying the weight versus caring. And I think those are two very different things. And you can be fully present with somebody's grief, and I believe still be able to set it down when your shift ends. And you can let yourself feel that, and that isn't the problem. But when we don't put it down, and when we continue to carry it, when it is not our grief to carry, that's when we can get burned out. And that's when I believe it can cause us problems, because it can prevent us from doing our best work. Okay, that's enough about that. What I currently have been working with several clients actually is what I call non-death grief. And let's talk about that and just widen our lens about using grief. So I think grief is and can be defined as the natural human response to a perceived loss. When it comes to death, it's often involuntary and we often don't control. And a lot of this has to do with God's business, and he's in control and he can prevent or cause or whatever he wants to. And I'm not going to pretend like I can explain that. But there is a part of grieving that is just a perceived loss. And it doesn't have to be death for it to count. So let's go into some details and some examples of how that can happen. If you had an expectation for how your life was going to go and something different happened and you have a loss, you see that as a gap between what you expected and what actually did. That's where I think grief lives more often than not. And a lot of times people say, I'm disappointed, but I just can't put it down. I'm like, yeah, because it's grief. You are grieving over something that you expected. You were grieving over something that you were hopeful for, but it never happened, or it happened differently. And so I like to give my clients, and I'm giving you permission to call it grief because that's what I believe it is. So let's give some examples. One is relationship grief. This could be a breakup, a divorce, a friendship, maybe that quietly faded, or honestly, a relationship that never became what you hoped it would be. A lot of times we skip over that last one. I know lots of people who are grieving in a marriage that technically is still intact, technically still is going well enough, but because the closeness that you pictured, that you wanted, that you are trying to cultivate has never shown up yet. So you can grieve over your marriage. I talk to women all the time who are grieving a friendship that just kind of faded and went cold. There was no fight. There was no big ending. They're just, for whatever reason, life, season, moving, created some distance, and they feel a real loss of that degree of friendship that they had before. There can also be career and job grief. Maybe you were laid off. Maybe you left a job that you loved because something changed in your life and you needed to. Maybe you were a nurse that had to step back from bedside care because your body couldn't handle those shifts anymore. You had to switch to something that was more doable for you at that time, right? This isn't just a schedule change or a job change. It really can leave you grieving a version of yourself, a version of your professional identity that you used to have that you don't now. I also coach on this a lot, on grieving over a child or a spouse's choice. And it's a very tender spot for a lot of my clients. When your child chooses a path, a partner, a belief, a lifestyle, whatever, that isn't what you pictured when you were raising them, when you held them as a baby, when you created this life in your mind, when you see their potential and they are not meeting up to it per se, you can, fully love your child and still be grieving the picture that you had in your head of how you thought their life would go. And these two things can be very true at the same time, and neither of them cancel each other out. And I truly do believe it's grieving. A diagnosis. This could be a diagnosis for yourself, your child, your spouse, a parent. And this is even a manageable diagnosis, but it also comes with grieving the life that you assumed that you would have. A lot of times our brain just wants to create that anxiety, like, oh my gosh, now we're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z in the future. And now we have all these appointments and treatments and limitations. And there's that nagging fear of how long and how hard is this going to be? Even when things today are okay, this is how our brain catastrophizes in trying to protect ourselves, right? It's one of those thought distortions that aren't helpful. And I see this a lot with a diagnosis. You can also, I kind of alluded to this before, but a season of life ending. this is an empty nest, right? I was talking to a mom the other day. She's like, my baby is not taking 2 naps anymore. And I really miss that time, right? She's grieving that time. This is when your parents are no longer the ones who are taking care of you, but now you're taking care of them and your children, right? That sandwich generation. And you're realizing that everyone is leaning on you now. Okay, that can cause grief. Nothing bad has happened here. Something has just switched, something has ended. And we often need to grieve over that. The last one that I thought of was a sense of identity. Like, I miss that person I was before I got divorced, before I moved here, before I was just the mom, just the caregiver, just the nurse, just the teacher. A lot of my clients are grieving the version of themselves that they can't quite find anymore, especially when you're burned out. And that's real grief, even though nobody is labeling that or helping you through that grief process. I also do believe that disappointment and grief have a lot of overlap, and they are both part of being human. Some losses seem small, some seem really enormous, and you can choose to call it what you want. But I have found in my coaching that labeling it as grief hits home more, and it's relatable, and they can process it better when we actually call it grief. Now, for just a minute, I want to talk about how some people don't process grief, or what grief looks like when it might be hiding. And this can get a little tricky. Grief doesn't always look like crying on the couch or having to come apart or needing to take days off of work, but it can look like over control. It can look like hypervigilance in every detail of your life, because somewhere in your brain, in your nervous system, you think if you can just control enough, maybe you won't hurt again. Maybe you stay so busy that you can't feel that emotion. It can also look like emotional withdrawal, where you isolate yourself and you pull away from people in protecting yourself. It can also look like comparison, like sizing up your kids, your job, your body, your marriage against somebody else's. And underneath a lot of this hiding is shame and self-blame. I see this a lot, again, with healthcare workers and controlling outcomes and judging yourself for what you should have done or didn't do, or et cetera, et cetera. I also think that sometimes we have like this quiet competition about how we should grieve, or we need to be very dramatic in our grief to prove that we loved somebody who has passed by. And I was reminded of this, of a sketch on Studio C. It's a comedy show that I really like. And this one sketch, it shows 2 couples standing each at a different headstone, and they are quietly mourning. And one couple notices the other couple, they're crying, and so they start to cry a little bit louder. And as the camera cuts back and forth between the two, you can tell that they're trying to one-up each other. And one couple wails a little bit louder, and then cuts back to the other person, and they have all this mascara running down their face, and they're really loud. And at one point there's a crow, and it is pretty humorous. And I thought, that is so true, that a lot of us do this. Maybe not, of course, that dramatically, but we feel like sometimes we need to post on social media in a certain way, or we talk about somebody we lost using a certain tone. Almost like we need to perform our grief loudly enough so that people actually do know that we love them. Or I do know that some people grieve over moving past their grief, and then they judge themselves. And sometimes they feel like they're betraying their loved one from moving on. And on the flip side of that coin, when someone seems to be handling death really well, people can judge that too. Today is actually the 1-year anniversary of when my mother-in-law passed away. And I tell my husband all the time, man, I miss your mom so much. And people ask me, how is your father-in-law doing? I said, you know what? He's actually doing really well. And he is. And I'm not going to say that he doesn't miss his wife, but he's just a person that has a lot of hope and a lot of faith. He doesn't seem to be lonely. He has built himself a very good community in his area, and he is social and he does a lot of things. And yes, there are times when he is sad, but he also grieves differently. He's not a crier. He doesn't get emotional, and that's totally fine. That's not really how I do it, but that's not wrong. What I want to say here is that there's no silent contest to win. Nobody's grief needs to be louder or quieter than anybody else's to be real, and we need to be better at allowing people to grieve how they want. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, this is something I learned in my life coaching school when we were talking about grief, is the phrase of time heals all wounds. And I think that phrase can be a little bit misleading. It's not actually the time doing the healing, but it's us. It's us widening our window of tolerance, per se, to handle that grief. Time gives us a chance to expand our ability to handle it. And a window of tolerance is the best way that I can describe it when, especially with death, when death is new, that window is very narrow. And so a photo, a song, a smell can hit you out of your capacity to cope. And it's hard. And over time, with support and with processing, that window widens. And it doesn't mean that that loss gets smaller, but your capacity to hold that loss gets bigger. And this is nervous system work. And don't be surprised if a memory still hits you hard 2 years later when you're not expecting it. That doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong or that other people are doing it right. Okay, I did want to end with just some ways of how I think is a healthy way to process grief. And this can be applied whether it's death or a non-death loss. First is name it to tame it. This is not using judgment, just call the loss what it is. And write it out. I have a podcast on a mindful release. I find that very helpful to write out your feelings, write out your thoughts, no judgment. And you can talk this out. You can write it out. And you can even ask, what am I making it mean about me, about my life? What is my loss? What was I expecting? Because often it's not the loss itself that wrecks us, but it's the story that we attach to it. It's the expectation that we had hoped. It's the things that we have attached to that person, that season, that relationship that didn't come about. That is the hard part, right? I love Byron Katie, how she says, you can argue with reality all you want, but you will be wrong only 100% of the time. And I know it's often very hard to accept reality, but I found that arguing with it doesn't help me show up in a way that I want to, or help me process my grief better. So name it, write it down. The third is to allow it. We kind of talked about that. Start letting those feelings move through you. And the fourth is to have an emotional protocol. I think I've talked about this before, but this is what helps me a lot. And I tried this just this morning, as it was the year anniversary of my mother-in-law's passing. I sat down and looked through a lot of pictures of her and thought about her, and I was taking the time to allow those feelings of grief to come. I was surprised because I wasn't crying. I was just so grateful for all of the experiences that we had with her and together, and to look at the pictures and be happy. And it was good time for me to allow those feelings of grief to come up if they wanted to. And this time they didn't. But for an emotional protocol, what you do is you set aside time to allow feelings to come. You are inviting them to come up, and you are allowing them talking time. You are looking at them and processing them, and you're not scared of them or pushing them away. When we have an emotion that keeps creeping up that we don't want to deal with or can't at that moment, if we set aside a time, Tuesday at 1:00, I'm going to think about this and write it out and allow all those feelings that I typically want to resist, they can come out and be processed. And when they come up throughout the week, you just say, okay, I hear you, but right now I don't want to get hijacked by your emotions. So we're going to work on you at our designated time. And you might have to do it every day for a little while and then spread it out to every other day and then once a week and then once a month, whatever. You get to choose. You get to choose how it works for you. But I have found that has been very helpful for me and my clients. The fourth is when you feel like you are in a grieving time, just take good care of yourself. I know it's hard, but it always helps if we can rest our bodies, when we can eat regular, when we can get outside, because grief does affect us physically, not just emotionally. And so we need to remember to take care of our physical body. And then the last one is to invite connection instead of isolating. I think that's, for some people, a very natural thing, and almost being social is the opposite of what a lot of us want to do. But isolation is grief's best friend, and it often isn't helpful. Obviously, there are times that you can be alone, and that's good. But when we can connect to other people, that helps us feel that support and process our grief. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. So just a quick wrap up. Grief is often the involuntary perceived loss of somebody or something. And it is proof that you love deeply, that something and somebody mattered to you. I believe it's healthy to be able to feel that and at the same time not carry it with you. And when we can remember what is ours to grieve and what is ours not to, we can show up more intentionally. And sometimes avoiding grief can show up like overfunctioning, hypervigilance, burnout, and control that pushes us to try harder so that the pain can't catch up with you. And I want you to know that there is another way through it. And that's what I help people do and the work that I do with my clients. So if you learned something, I would appreciate you sharing it. And don't forget to rate or review. I will see you next week. Every week, you're learning something new here on this podcast, and that is a powerful first step. But guess what? Information alone doesn't create transformation. True change happens when you start to think differently and shift the nervous system patterns that drive your behavior. As a coach and an emotional resiliency expert, that is the work I do. I love to walk alongside you, whether it's one-on-one, in a small group that you choose, or with your workplace team. I can help you retrain your brain and nervous system so that stress no longer runs the show. You'll find ways to connect with me in the show notes. Let's do this work together.